Hello, this is Michael Smith, and I am your instructor of record for Anthropology 400. And I wanted to just kind of give you a lead in and introduction to the things we'll be talking about over the next 3 weeks because they are extremely important. And I think that you'll find that to be true as well as we get into the subject matter because they pertain so well to what you and I are facing today in our country and our world. I think if we had to sit down and have a chat, that you would agree that things are in chaos, not only in our country, but around the world. People are doing some crazy things, and sometimes we blame it on the COVID pandemic disrupting our lives. Sometimes we blame it on politics and politicians. But the reality is that we study these things for as far as we look at humans, and that's what anthropology is all about. We study humans for these various trends, and humans are a very interesting species on the planet because they encompass all kinds of things. We have the ability to work and make tools and produce an environment that like you have around you. I mean, when you look at this computer screen, you realize that this is a relatively new invention, that we couldn't have done. Zoom, 10 years ago would have been impossible, but today we have all of these great technologies, and we would tend probably to think that's what makes us the greatest species on the planet is our technology. But we also know that technology brings with it various problems. It is addictive. It does have a downside. When you listen to a pill advertisement on the news in the evening, and a pill is a technology, they'll spend most of that 60 seconds telling you how it's going to kill you, but it's also going to cure the one thing that you are taking it for. So technology does have that kind of a downside and a problem. As I said, anthropology is the study of humankind. Of all times and all places, it is humankind in general, from our first appearance on this earth until the present time. There's somebody somewhere looking at that, considering that, talking about that, trying to piece together what we know about humans. And of course, there's always the great debate among people as to where we came from. And we have these stories that have arisen through our religion and through our philosophies as to how humans have come to be. And then, of course, science came in the room in the 1800s with Darwin's theory of evolution. And the more we study that, the more we realize that all of these things, science has some validity, and there is constantly a warfare that's going on between science and religion over the question of origins. And we won't talk very much about origins in this class, but we do want to talk about human behavior and how many disciplines focus upon humans in some way. We talk about, some of you might be thinking about nursing school. You're going to take anatomy and physiology. You will concentrate on the species as biological organisms, and that's a very important part of what you'll be studying. Anthropology focuses on the interconnections and the interdependence of all aspects of the human experience in all places, in the present, in the past, and hopefully in the future. Well before there was ever written history, there were humans on the earth. We failed to realize that. If you were studying Western civilization, we would pick up the discussion when man began to build cities and live together in larger groups. But there was a whole period before that of which we don't have written history. We start teaching history when things were starting to be written down and preserved. But before that, there was a long history before that happened. Those of you that are cognizant with the Bible realize that the stories of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, happened before there was written history. They were finally apparently written down by Moses some centuries later. So we don't have eyewitness accounts, and we don't have written copies of what went on there. And those chapters, those books were written down at a much later date, made up and compiled from the oral histories that had been passed down. And so you realize that those are not considered valid history. If you accept those, you accept them by faith. You don't accept them because they are historical in any sense of the word. When we look at the broad aspects of humanity, This is kind of a holistic perspective. It equips anthropologists to address something that we call human nature. What is it about human nature that causes us to do the things that we do? You and I have been eyewitness to the things that happened on January the 6th this year, in which the mob in DC tried to overthrow the democracy, and they still are working on that. And I've always said it's much easier to tip the scales into anarchy than it is to bring it back to a period of peace. We've not had that in our history of over 300 years of very many uprisings of that nature that were violent. But that is a part now of human nature, it seems. And there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of pent up anger. There are a lot of things that are done, people shooting each other. And we've had more people killed in the last year from gunshot wounds and from killing each other than we've ever had in our history. And so we look at all kinds of different things and different aspects. Anthropology is a part of that. And so you're going to be spending some time in the next 3 weeks looking at this holistic perspective. And it allows us to guard against a lot of things, against possible personal and cultural biases. We all have those. We have a lens that we look at the world through that's called our worldview. Every one of us does that. One of the problems with history is that when we look at history through our worldview, we make mistakes and we don't get a clear vision. Let me give you an example of that. I was a pastor for 20 years. There is what we call a Christian worldview. That's the lens through which we look at the world, and we assess the world from a Christian perspective. And when you look at American history from that, we want to read into American history a Christian founding, that our founding fathers were somehow Christian and they came here to start Christian societies, be a city on the hill. But when you really understand the history and you study it without your preconceived biases, you understand there were many different motivations for people coming to the New World, that America was never and has never been by number distinctly Christian. In those early days, there were over 10 million Native Americans on the continent, spoke 338 different languages, had 338 different tribes, and they were animists and believed in the Great Spirit, a lot of things, but they definitely were not Christians. We had Muslims, we had Jews, we had all manner of other religions, Hindus and Shintoists and Buddhists, all here in America from the beginning. And they would raise a voice and say, no, you've never been distinctly Christian, but it serves the purpose of some political gain to say, yes, this nation is Christian, we need to get back to that. And so we need to change laws to make that happen. Those are the kind of things that we study as anthropologists. And it's always interesting to me to study religion and its effect upon people, because it does have a tremendous effect. And so the other thing is ethnocentrism, that we look at our ethnicity as the only one, the important one, that our culture is the best and the only proper one to have. You hear those words among people who say to our other people in the country that don't necessarily speak English as a first language, they will say, you need to learn to speak English if you're going to live here. But they have a different language, they have a different culture. Some speak Spanish, some speak Chinese, some speak Japanese. They feel the same way about their culture, that it is superior to everything else. And so we have to guard against that. That's one of the things that we study in anthropology, is how can we understand the people that we live around. You are going to be working with people that come from a Muslim background, from a Christian background, from a Jewish background, from Shintoism, from Buddhism, from Hinduism. All these things are of vital importance. And so it's important that we learn these things and think about, how do we approach that? Why is it important for me to know about all these different things and different people that I work with? Because you can get along with them better if you understand their religious sensibilities or their dietary requirements or things of that nature. We're not so quick to judge people and to misjudge them, as we often can do when we think that we're the only one. There is in America, this idea that the white race is superior. We started that with Native Americans, and we started it with others, and it's going to be quite an interesting aspect as we look at this to understand that we're pretty culture bound. We're based on the assumption that the world and the reality that we live in is the only one and the best one. In this course, I want to talk about a lot of things. I came from a particular area of the country. I grew up in South Carolina. I spent 60 years there. As you know, there is a Southern culture, which is distinctive. And as I mentioned in your discussion board for week one, we tend to kind of narrow down from we're all human. That's the major culture. And then we come from human down to American, down to South Carolinian, down to Southern, down to South Carolinian, then maybe down to town. Each one of those has a different cultural ramification. Most of the things you've heard about South Carolina are true as far as prejudice and race and religion. It's a very hard place to live. And I grew up in that. I grew up in the backwoods, and by any stretch of the imagination, I should still have those sensibilities. But one thing that really changed me was that starting in 1980, I began to travel and see the world. I went to the Middle East in 1980. I have been back there 11 times. I went to the Philippines in 1985 and spent 5 summers there working with Filipino people. While I was there, I walked 3 miles into the jungle one day to preach or speak to a tribe of headhunters that were still living as hunter-gatherers in the middle of a jungle. And I learned a lot of other things about people that I didn't know about those cultures. And for me to come in and say, well, your culture is wrong, you need to change this or change that, would be a mark of, me, my privilege, saying you need to live like I live. So I've done a lot of that. I've been to Russia. I have been to the Ukraine. I have been to Mexico and Canada, of course. I've been in Japan, Taiwan, Korea. All those places all have different distinctive cultures, and they are all pretty cultural bound many times. They all believe that their culture is better. Just because we have always forced that on people. And we do that. We force our culture on people. They're going to have to be what we are if they are going to come up to our standard. And so, there are people that don't want to work around anybody that's not white or male or whatever. So those are the dangers that we come into. Another aspect that I hope to bring into our discussions is that I've taught for a number of years Native American history, and I do have some Creek blood of my own in my ancestry, of which I'm very proud. And we realized that when American settlers came here, that they imposed their European ways upon Indians and said to them, now, if you will do what we tell you, if you'll meet the standards of civilization, we'll let you live among us. Those standards were dress like Europeans, adopt Christianity, quit roaming around, become farmers, use our language, don't use your religion or your language. And we imposed that upon them, regardless of the fact that, unlike what Columbus said, he said, basically, these people have no religion because I don't see a Bible, I don't see a cross. They're lazy. The men go out and hunt and fish all day. The women do all the work, not realizing that they weren't like Europeans. Europeans went out hunting and fishing for recreation. The natives went out to do it to bring protein home, to feed their families. It was a much different appraisal. But remember, they're looking through European glasses. And so we eventually take their land from them. And no matter how much they tried to be civilized, 5 tribes, including the Cherokee, met every standard of civilization, but they were still forced to leave their lands and move west in the 1828 Great Removal, called the Trail of Tears. So these things of how we behave ourselves and how we treat each other, man's inhumanity to man knows no end. As we have seen in the Holocaust with the killing of 6 million Jews, we have seen it in the Rwandan Tutsi rebellions in Africa, where they committed genocide against each other. I have taught some of those students who live in refugee camps there and have seen that firsthand. We had the Serbs being destroyed by the people in Kosovo in the 1980s. Man doesn't seem to learn the lessons of history, and they still are brutally, man's a dangerous organism. If you don't believe that, just look at the number of people killed in the last few months in schools and in shopping malls and other places of business. I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine that we have, we would do this to school kids that are trying to get an education, that someone would go in and kill, shoot them down, and them 6 and 7 years old, and they've done nothing to the people that kill them. So we understand that we need to understand more of what makes humanity tick and why it's purposeful. So I want to just kind of give you an introduction to that. We will look forward to some great discussions in the coming days. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.